Welcome everybody to the meeting tonight. We'll be getting started here very shortly, and I'll provide you a quick intro to what we're going to do tonight, and then we'll get right into it. And first, we want to thank everybody for coming out tonight to the virtual open house for the 2022 season changes. I'm Roger Phillips. I'm the Public Information Supervisor, and we're going to be working with a bunch of other folks here in the department tonight, and I'll introduce them shortly. But I wanted to give you a little background on what we're doing tonight. Normally, we do our season setting every other year, and this would be an off year, but with the disease outbreak of EHD and the positive tests that we got for Cwd, that prompted us to propose some season changes and when we normally wouldn't. And we have a Cwd plan in place. We've had it in place for a long time, but what we didn't know is what animal we would find it in or where we would find it. So that plan certainly had to be adaptive, and we're in the process of that now, making that plan really come to life. And that's part of what we'll be talking about tonight. These season proposals, we're in a comment period for those that started on February 22nd. And the deadline to comment is March 13th. And you can find access to that on our website and comment there. We're midway through that process, and we want to provide this opportunity to provide people with more information about this unique situation that we're encountering. The proposals and the public comments that we garner from this process will go before the Fish and Game Commission on March 23rd and 24th at their meeting in Boise. With all commission meetings, there will be a public hearing, so people will have another opportunity to talk to the commission before they make a decision on this. Want to remind you, because this is an off year, we will be doing our full regularly scheduled season setting later this year. So these are kind of in a way temporary, and we're going to be doing this whole process again later. And of course, you'll have the opportunity to participate in that as well. Now, the way things are going to go tonight, we are going to have about a 15-minute presentation by our state wildlife manager, Rick Ward, and that will be followed by a question and answer session. Excuse me, please. We've gotten some questions in advance from the public. We've also pulled some questions from the public comments that people have already given. And we'll also be taking some live questions tonight, and you can submit those through the Q&A feature at the bottom right of the screen. We might not be able to get to all of them. We're going to do our best. We ask you to be civil with those questions and also on topic what we're talking about tonight. And hopefully a lot of those will be answered through Rick's presentation. We ask you to be patient with us. We're refining this live video format, and it is a work in progress. And we're going to do our best to get you good, timely information, as well as the chance to interact with the public on these things. So I'd like to quickly introduce our panelists tonight before I turn it over to Rick. And as I've mentioned, we have Rick Ward, who is our state wildlife manager. Again, I'm Roger Phillips, Public Information Supervisor. We have Tricia Hebden, our Assistant Wildlife Bureau Chief. We have Toby Boudreau, the Deer and Elk Coordinator. We have Connor Lease off camera, but very, very important, helping us run the meeting. He's our Public Information Specialist. And then up in the Clearwater, we have JJ Tier, the Regional Supervisor up there. Clay Hickey, our Environmental Staff Biologist, and Jana Livingston, our Regional Wildlife Biologist. And with that, again, thank you all for coming out tonight, and I will turn this over to Rick Ward.
Okay, thanks, Roger. So I am going to go through kind of a high-level overview of some of the disease issues, primarily focusing on chronic wasting disease. I will touch on some of the EHD, the epizootic hemorrhagic disease. Kind of at the end, I'll kind of go through what some of the differences are. I know there's a little bit of confusion out there. And as Roger said, this is not our usual season setting process for big game. That's usually an odd number of years. So we we will be revisiting all big game seasons a year from now. So do bear in mind that what we are talking about right now will come back before the public and the commission next year. Yeah, as Roger mentioned, the 23rd and 24th are the commission meetings. The evening of the 23rd, there is a public meeting in Boise here at the new headquarters building, 600 South Walnut. If anybody would like to come give testimony to the commission, that's the time to do it. On the 24th, it's the business meeting in there. There's not public testimony. Yeah, one quick note, the commission does have the authority to change any seasons any time. So this is a bit unusual to have this kind of proposal go in front of the commission at this time of year, but this is considered an emergency situation, so that's why we're dealing with that now. Yeah, we talked about the diseases, and yeah, I will focus mostly on CWD, talk a little bit about what that is, why it matters in Idaho, and try and get some information out there. But there is a lot more information on CWD on our website. I encourage you to look at that if you're interested. And also, I encourage people to do some of their own research if they feel so inclined. CWD is not a new thing. It's new to Idaho, but it's been around since 1967. And it's been around in a lot of places since 2000 or so. So it's not a new thing. There's a ton of research out there. There's a ton of management. Some states have been dealing with it for quite a while, especially Colorado and Wyoming. So I encourage people to do their own homework if they feel so inclined. So there's lots of stuff out there. And with that, I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Give me just a moment to get that rolling. Let's see. Okay, we good? Okay. So as I mentioned, yeah, this is a bit unusual. This is not our normal season setting process, but we do occasionally have changes to big game seasons in the off years. So I want to talk some about specifically what CWD is, and just a moment here. Turn off a very small computer. So CWD, chronic wasting disease, is caused by prions, which are misfolded or deformed proteins. Prions aren't living organisms like bacteria or viruses. They're incredibly sturdy and difficult to eradicate from the environment. CWD affects cervids or members of the deer family. And in Idaho, of course, that means white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, and moose. Transmission of CWD between individual animals isn't entirely understood. There's likely some combination of animal-to-animal contact and environmental contamination. CWD prions can be found in saliva, urine, and feces of live animals that can then be spread to other animals or contaminate the environment. And decaying carcasses of CWD positive animals are known to contaminate the soil. Some plants can uptake CWD prions from the soil and potentially infect an otherwise healthy deer, elk, or moose that consumes that plant. Mule deer, based on all the research and findings in other states, mule deer seem to be the most susceptible to contracting CWD, followed closely by white-tailed deer. Elk and moose are, at least by what we've seen to this date, are somewhat less susceptible than either deer species. And important to note, CWD is always fatal. Once an animal contracts CWD, they will die from the disease or complications from it. CWD has a relatively long incubation period of 18 to 24 months before symptoms display, or before animals display outward symptoms. In addition, there is no practical way to test live animals for CWD. CWD was first found in captive mule deer in northeast Colorado in 1967. It's unclear where it came from or how those deer contracted it, but CWD in wild deer and elk remained fairly contained in northeast Colorado and southeast Wyoming for several decades. However, beginning around 2000, CWD started cropping up in both wild and captive deer and elk throughout North America. The exact causes of the spread are difficult to determine for certain and are open to speculation. Regardless, Louisiana detected their first case of CWD in wild white-tailed deer last month, making them the 28th state in the nation to detect CWD. We look at two metrics when assessing CWD levels: geographic spread and prevalence rate. Geographic spread is pretty self-explanatory. Prevalence rate is simply the proportion of animals in a given area or population with CWD. That number is derived from testing a sample of the overall deer or elk population. Put this graph on here to illustrate two important points when talking about prevalence rate and managing CWD. The first point is that the scale of time we're talking about is in years. Compared to something like EHD, CWD is a relatively slow-moving disease, at least until it reaches a certain prevalence rate, and that's the second point. Colorado has found that a prevalence rate of around 5% is the threshold where prevalence increases exponentially and CWD spreads rapidly to new populations. This graph shows why CWD is so important to us and why it matters to deer and elk populations, with examples from Wyoming and Colorado. As the CWD prevalence rate increases, the growth rate of the population decreases. In this graph, 1 is a steady population where annual births and survival equal annual deaths. Anything above 1 is a growing population, and anything below 1 is a shrinking population. As the amount of CWD in the population increases, the projection is that the growth rate will continue to decline. And the mechanism behind this really is pretty straightforward. Adult female survival and productivity are what drive deer and elk populations. Adult females with CWD have a much shorter life expectancy than adult females without CWD, and therefore produce fewer fawns or calves over their lifetime than non-CWD females. Multiply that out over a number of generations, and you've got a shrinking population. The higher the prevalence rate, the more rapid the population decline. Fish and Game has been sampling for CWD in Idaho since 1997, with almost 21,000 samples taken since then. The writing has been on the wall for years that CWD was likely to show up in Idaho at some point, and that happened last fall. In November, we were notified by our testing lab that samples from 2 Idaho mule deer tested positive for CWD. These were the first confirmed positive tests for CWD in Idaho, and both deer were bucks harvested by hunters in October in the Slate Creek drainage of Unit 14. Unit 14 sits roughly between Riggins on the south and Grangeville on the north. We immediately began additional check stations on Highway 95 to collect more samples from ongoing hunts. And the Fish and Game Commission authorized emergency hunts to collect more CWD samples, and we did that in December with CWD surveillance deer hunts in units 14 and 15 and portions of 11A, 13, 18, and 23. Sampling results for deer are shown on this map. The green points are locations of animals harvested and tested negative, and the red marks are for positive cases. In total, we collected 524 samples from both species of deer in the surveillance area. Of that, we have a total of 4 samples from hunter harvest that tested positive for CWD. The original 2 mule deer bucks harvested in October, 1 whitetail buck harvested in Slate Creek in November, and 1 whitetail doe harvested in December on John Day Creek, just south of Slate Creek. In addition to those, a whitetail buck that died on private property in Slate Creek was brought by the landowner to one of our check stations where samples were taken, and that deer ultimately tested positive. We were initially after enough samples to estimate the CWD prevalence rates in 3 different sample areas. While we didn't get as many samples as we were initially after, we did get enough samples to develop prevalence estimates for both deer species in Unit 14. For mule deer, the prevalence rate comes out at 1.8%. For whitetails, that number is a little higher at 2%. The fact that we didn't detect CWD in surrounding units, coupled with the low prevalence rate, suggests that we've detected CWD early. However, it will take additional testing in surrounding units at higher sampling rates to develop any real confidence in that distribution of CWD, and that is one of our plans for this fall's hunting season. For elk, we did collect CWD samples at check stations for ongoing hunts in the surveillance area. The sample size is much smaller than for deer at 61 total elk samples. We had no positive elk samples from hunter harvested animals, but there was an ailing cow near Whitebird that was reported to the department by a landowner in December of last year. That elk was determined to be close to death and was euthanized by a conservation officer. That elk subsequently tested positive. The fact that CWD was detected in elk somewhat distant from the CWD positive deer changed the calculus about distribution of the disease. We know from other states that prevalence rates in elk are lower than in deer where they overlap, generally much lower. But we also know from past animal collaring efforts that both elk and white-tailed deer near Whitebird move seasonally between units. Where this particular elk came from, where it contracted CWD, whether or not it was a migratory individual is unknown, but it's possible that it made at least one seasonal migration while infected with CWD. One of the advantages we have in Idaho is that we have the opportunity to learn from other states about what's worked and what hasn't worked to keep CWD prevalence rates low and reduce its spread. Older bucks are the segment of the deer population most likely to harbor and spread CWD. We also know that CWD spread is correlated with deer density. Structuring hunts to manage for a younger age structure in the population and reducing overall deer densities has been shown to reduce prevalence or keep it from increasing in deer in Colorado, Montana, and Utah, and is currently used in all 3 states as a containment strategy. Additionally, CWD management plans for all 3 states identify harvest management as a primary tool for CWD control. For Idaho, the overall goal with CWD management at this point is to keep CWD contained within Unit 14 and at or near 2% prevalence rate for both deer species. In other words, the goal is to maintain the status quo of CWD. I want to emphasize here the goal of minimizing and reducing the spread of CWD. That means keeping the prevalence rate low. Reducing deer densities and managing for a younger age structure in Unit 14 will mean fewer deer and fewer mature bucks down the road, and there's no 2 ways about that. Idaho is fortunate in that by all indications, we've detected CWD early. As far as we can tell at this point, CWD is contained to Unit 14, and proposed changes to deer and elk seasons are limited to Unit 14. Even though we found it early and prevalence is relatively low, leaving CWD unchecked and allowing it to increase and spread unabated to other units and other deer and elk populations threatens the viability of those populations. It will then spread CWD on from there. Doing nothing when we know CWD is in Idaho would be irresponsible. For changes to the mule deer buck season in Unit 14 for 2022, we're scoping 2 options. The first option is an increase in the number of tags in the controlled buck hunt from 180 tags currently to 400 tags. Hunter success rates in this hunt have been very high, averaging 65% over the last 5 years. With 400 tags, we'd expect that success rate to go down some, but we'd still expect that hunters would harvest somewhere between 30 and 40% of the adult buck population in the unit in the first year. Under the current 180 tag system, hunters likely harvest 10 to 20% of the adult population each year. The second option is to replace the controlled buck hunt with a general buck only season with the same season dates of October 10 to November 20. Under a general season, we would expect hunters to harvest at least 40% of the adult bucks in the unit and maybe quite a bit more. For antlerless mule deer, we're scoping only 1 option, and that is to add a new extra antlerless hunt, 200 tags with the same season dates as the buck hunt, October 10 to November 20. We would expect to see hunters harvest 8 to 12% of the adult doe population in this hunt. We're also scoping 2 options for whitetail seasons in Unit 14. The first option is to add 2 hunts to, in addition to the existing either sex general season, an extra antlerless hunt and an extra antlered hunt with 250 tags each, and season dates that coincide with the general season hunt of October 10 to November 20. We would expect to see buck harvest increase by about 20% and doe harvest to increase by about 35% over the 5-year average. The second option for whitetails is to extend the general either sex season to close on December 31 rather than November 20. We know that harvesting bucks later in the season, especially during and shortly after the rut, can reduce the risk of spreading CWD by removing more CWD positive animals that are taken by hunters earlier in the season. Under this scenario, we'd expect to see an increase in hunter participation from hunters coming to Unit 14, specifically to hunt the late season. However, we also know that most whitetails are on private property in 14, and hunter access to those deer will determine overall harvest. Landowner acceptance of additional hunters is one of the issues we're looking to get feedback on. Last proposal related to CWD is to increase the number of tags from 50 to 80 and increase the hunt area slightly in 14-1 landowner permission elk hunt so that it will encompass the areas where CWD has been detected to date. The overall objective here is to increase our CWD sample size on elk in areas where we've detected CWD. That covers the CWD portion. I want to touch on the EHD section, and I want to draw some distinctions or emphasize the distinction between CWD and EHD. CWD is new to Idaho and has only been detected in 6 animals, with potential for spread and long-lasting damage to deer and elk populations is the concern. Because of drought conditions last year, EHD or epizootic hemorrhagic disease flared up last summer in the Clearwater region. EHD is spread by biting midges and acts quickly, often killing the deer within 72 hours, but also is not 100% fatal. White-tailed deer got hit hard with EHD last summer, and the areas hit hardest are shown in the green areas on this map. The main point for this discussion is that EHD has had its impact on the whitetail population as we see it back to a low level background disease that's been around for years, whereas CWD is slow moving and just getting going in Idaho. Proposed season changes in response to the EHD outbreak are shown here. A reduction of a total of 1,500 antlerless extra tags. The idea here is to take some of the hunting pressure off these units after the EHD die-off. We estimate that a total of 6,000 to 10,000 white-tailed deer died last year as a result of EHD. These extra hunts are limited to private land or private cultivated land with a 1-mile buffer. You'll see that Unit 14 is in there, and that might seem a little contradictory given the proposals we're making for CWD. However, Unit 14 is part of the 8-1 X youth hunt and averages only about 6 whitetails being taken out of Unit 14 on this hunt each year. So with that, that concludes my portion. And I think I will turn it back to Roger at this point and let him take it from here.
Thanks, Rick, for that presentation. There's a lot of good information in there, and hopefully a lot of answers or a lot of questions got answered there. We do have some that have come in, and we've got some that came in before the meeting, and we'll lead off with one of them that we got prior to the meeting. And that is, Rick will answer this as well. And that is, if the Unit 14 mule deer tag is switched to a general tag, which is option 2, will the amount of general tags sold to non-residents be capped?
Good question. So that is not automatic. We did make the changes to general seasons 2 years ago, so that all general deer seasons are non-resident participation is limited in general deer seasons by unit. And if this were to go from a controlled hunt to a general hunt, it's probable that we would recommend that to the commission, but it is not automatic. So that is reliant on a commission action to do that.
Okay, thank you, Rick. We have another question here. Tricia is going to answer this one for us. Tricia Hebden, our Assistant Wildlife Bureau Chief. And the question is specifically, how does an animal contract CWD from the environment? Is it ingested or ingest respiratory or contact with prion on soil, etc.?
So what we do know about prions is that prions are shed in the saliva of animals as well as in their urine and in their feces. So when animals have nose-to-nose contact with each other, there's thought to be transmission through that route, as well as when animals are urinating in the soil or their feces and they're feeding in those areas, it can contaminate plants as well as be on the ground. And so animals can get it from multiple mechanisms.
Excellent. Thank you, Tricia. And we have another question. Toby Boudreau, our deer elk coordinator, is going to answer this one for us. And if a hunter is not supposed to remove the head and spinal column fluid from the kill site of a harvested animal, what is Fish and Game asking hunters to do?
I think, Roger, that's a good question, and it seems a little contradictory, but the reality is, if a hunter feels comfortable taking the samples, which are lymph nodes in the back of the neck, then they can just bring out those samples to us and leave the rest of the head and neck in the field. If they don't feel comfortable, then, leaving the maximum amount of spine in the field would be best, and just bringing out the head with about 4 inches of neck attached to it, and bringing that out to a check station where we can take those samples for them. So understood. We do have some videos on our website on how to take samples that are really helpful. And you, for instance, the first CWD detection in Idaho was actually taken by a hunter and then brought into us after he took it out of the field. So it is very easy, and we have videos to help people learn how to do that.
Excellent. Thank you, Toby. This question goes back to Rick. Why reduce a population of game animals for a disease you don't even know the deer have unless you test for it? It doesn't seem to be affecting the game, so why be so reactive to something that isn't actively causing mortality?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I can understand that sentiment. The goal here really is prevention. That's what our primary objective is. Right now, what we want, like I said in my presentation, we want to keep the prevalence rate low at around 2% and keep it contained at 14. CWD is slow moving, but that doesn't mean it's not a threat. And we've seen that in other states where it's been allowed to increase. It has resulted in declining populations of deer and elk. So I guess the way I look at this is, we're at a place right now where we're forced to make some tough decisions. And I know for me, having spent the last 20 some years trying to grow more deer and elk, the idea of going in and implementing some measures to reduce deer numbers and reduce mature bucks, that's a hard pill to swallow. I think nobody wins with CWD. It's everybody loses. It's just how bad are we going to let it get? So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. It's easier to address it now. It's more likely to keep it contained now when the prevalence rate is low, and we think it's only in unit 14. So that's why we need to address it now.
Thank you, Rick. Toby, we have a question for you. Is the department trying to limit the spread of CWD through more harvest, or is the department trying to reduce populations in the area altogether?
Well, part of the control of CWD is to reduce deer density and to also reduce the age structure of the population. So we are trying to concentrate on unit 14 and the surrounding areas. And the reason that we go beyond unit 14 is because we know from radio collar movement that we have deer that interchange between unit 14, parts of unit 11A, 15, and so forth. So we are trying to really do the best job of reducing the deer density, because with reduced density, the disease seems to spread slower, and reduced prevalence also reduces the rate at which the disease spreads throughout the landscape. So really trying to contain it is where we're at right now, since as Rick said, we're not going to get rid of it.
Hey, Toby, since we have you there, and then sort of a follow-up question to that one. If mule deer herds are reduced to meet goals, or if mule deer herds are reduced and the goals are met, will they have a chance to later recover?
That's a great question, Roger. I think that once you go down the path of detecting CWD, it doesn't go away. There's been no instances in the states that have had it for 20, 30, 40, 50 years of CWD ever going away. So I think that Colorado has done a great job and has some great examples of how deer management has changed. They still have very robust buck-doe ratios, but they did reduce the age structure of the population, so they still have healthy deer populations, good hunting opportunities there, but they also, were able to bring those prevalence rates from 30% down into the 5 to 7% range. So it's never going to go back, and that's the crux and the importance of why we're trying to reduce the spread of CWD, because we don't want it to affect and spread around the state as it has in other states where it's been less checked. So
Thank you for that, Toby. We're gonna turn to Tricia. And we have a question. If your biggest concern is mule deer bucks spreading the disease, why are you adding mule deer doe harvest?
So the reason we're adding mule deer, good, I'm not on mute anymore. The reason that we are adding mule deer doe harvest is our biggest concern is about transmission and the spread of CWD. And though mule deer bucks can spread the disease at a greater rate, it's about reducing the amount of disease and the number of animals in the population. And that's really our greatest concern at this point in time. And that requires additional doe harvest in that area to reduce the overall population.
Thank you, Trish. We'll go back to Toby. A fairly quick question about processors. Are wild game processors refusing to process animals from the impacted area?
Roger, I can't say for certain, but I do know that in other places, in other parts of the state, where we've actually tried to educate processors on CWD and knowing that it's potentially coming from other states, and they're working on animals that could be positive from other states. Some processors have been more reluctant to process wild game, and I'm sure that some in the future will make that choice. But all the states that currently have active detections of CWD, they still have wild game meat processors that are actively taking care of people's carcasses.
Great, thank you, Toby. And Tricia would like to add some more to that.
Just so everybody's aware, we notified all of our wild game processors and taxidermists when we found out that we had a CWD positive. We've been working with them closely. We've had several contact us and talk to us about the risk. In that area at this point in time, we haven't had anyone that is actually in the CWD management zone that has said they're no longer going to process wild game. But we have been actively communicating with them and working with them.
Yeah, they've been great partners for this process, and we're assuming that they will continue to be. Toby, we'll go back to you for a moment here. We have a question about archery. Has there been any thoughts to extending the archery only elk season in order to better align with what appears to be later elk rut activity in September and early October?
That's a good question, Roger, and obviously, that's sort of a bigger bigger question, and I think that during the last elk planting effort, which was actually 6 years ago, we actually talked about sort of modifying season dates, and we didn't end up going there, but I can tell you that in the next elk planning process, which should be starting in the next year or so, which the public will be intimately involved with, we will address that question again, because it is a reality that the rut is could be moving a little later, and early September temperatures are just super hot and tough time to hunt elk anywhere. and keep meat in good condition also. So we did consider that in the last time, and we will likely talk about it again and gather public input on it too. So thanks for that question.
Thank you, Toby. And I want to bring in our folks from the Clearwater region. We have a question more specific or in line to EHD. And the question here is, didn't EHD already reduce whitetails in Unit 14?
Thanks for that question, Roger. Yeah, we are aware of, as Rick pointed out, that we did lose some whitetails in Unit 14 to EHD. It was those the local whitetail populations and kind of in those lower elevations where we saw most of that whitetail die-off happen. So it did affect them to a lesser degree. We did see while we were flying surveys this winter in the month of January that a lot of those places, whitetails from higher elevations, which were impacted to a lesser degree, had moved down and filtered into those areas. So we could see that there were still quite a large number of whitetails still in the area.
Thank you, Gianna. Tricia, we'll go back to you. This is kind of a two-part question. I think Rick addressed quite a bit of this, but I think the first part of this is an important one. If CWD isn't a threat to humans, why try to contain it?
Well, so thank you for the question. CWD that we're aware of at this point in time, doesn't impact humans, but it does impact both domestic and wild deer, elk, moose, and caribou, and reindeer. And if it's left unchecked in our populations, we're going to see population level declines. It's our job to try to manage our wild game populations into the future. And the best way to manage CWD that we know of, based on all of the other states around us that have experienced it, is to keep the amount of the disease low and contain its spread the best we can.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. I'm going to throw this one up to the Clearwater folks again. This just came in. We have a question: is the proposal for addressing EHD in Unit 11A, speaking to eliminating the extra antlerless tag, is fishing game speaking species specific, as in dropping only extra antlerless tags for whitetails or keeping extra antlerless tags for mule deer? And this is particularly in 11A, not in 14.
Yeah, I'll chime in with that, Roger, if you don't mind.
Thank you.
Yeah, currently that tag structure for the extra tags are for either species. We've been using that extra tag as kind of relief to landowners for deer depredations on croplands. Has been the historic why we've had it. I think we will, if we drop the hunts, it'll be dropped for both species at this time. We will be monitoring the EHD comeback in whitetails, and also along with that, maybe some of the mule deer populations in 11A as a result to densities and crop damage there. And if we feel a need in the future, as early as next season cycle or the ones past that, we could look at bringing that back. So that was kind of our intent with that. For now, our intent is to do it for both mule deer does and whitetail does.
Excellent. Thank you for that information, JJ. This one's back for Tricia. And this is an important one, and I think we definitely want to let folks know about it. Will there be mandatory CWD testing for animals harvested during these hunts? I assume we're talking Unit 14.
Thank you. I think while we would always prefer voluntary submission from our hunters, we are considering making mandatory CWD testing recommendations to our commission in March. At this point in time, we have not defined what the extent of those would be, or the game management units that we're talking about. We're definitely looking at game management unit 14, but it's going to be one of those topics that we're going to have to take to our commission and give them options and see how they feel about mandatory testing.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. I'm gonna send this one up to the Clearwater folks again. It was mentioned about the private land situation, and is there a way the department could help hunters and landowners coordinate so more hunters could have access to private lands, sort of like an access yes agreement just for these hunts to compensate landowners for allowing public access?
I can take that one, Roger.
Thank you, Clay Hickey.
Yeah, so we're in the process of reaching out to landowners and talking to them on, what might be the best way to address trying to get more hunters on there. And so I don't know that, we've got a specific answer for that. If it's a simple matter of a landowner not having hunters and would allow more hunters, for depredation hunts and some of the greenfield hunts, they can get a hold of us. We'll give, hunter names to them and they can reach out and get some folks. I don't know that we've talked specifically about trying something yet for access, yes, but we're going to be looking at it, and I anticipate so much of Unit 14, particularly late season, these animals are on private property. So working with the landowners is going to be key to getting hunters in there.
Okay, thank you, Clay. And we're gonna go back to Toby Boudreau. Has there been a long-term study on leaving animal populations alone instead of intervening to see if a population could possibly overcome the disease somehow? Since you can't live test animals, could some have immunity development?
So that's a great question, Roger. And 35 years ago, scientists theorized that CWD would completely extirpate deer populations, and obviously it does not. Deer still exist everywhere that it was found 57 years ago. However, I think the important thing is that in those places where they have not necessarily managed for low, younger age structure and lower densities, those populations are actually suffering population level effects of really high CWD infection rates. So, and what happens is that population declines anyways. Now, it probably won't ever go to zero, but as you let prevalence rates go up, remember, those prevalent rates are going to increase the spreading of the disease to more game management units and more deer populations, thus causing sort of a cascading effect of the disease on the landscape and the state. So our plan is to try to keep that prevalence below 5% for as long as possible to contain the disease and slow its spread to the maximum slowest pace we can find.
Thank you, Toby. We have another question here. We'll send this one over to Rick. You kind of answered this, and actually you have, but we see it cropping up again. And so can you please explain what's likely to happen in the near and longer term future if the number of deer that test positive remains about the same?
Yeah, that is an excellent question. I guess it depends really on where, if there are, let's say, I read that to mean prevalence rate, not the number of deer. So we will be taking a lot more samples up in 14 and the surrounding units this coming hunting season. So if the prevalence rate, we detect it still at about 2%, and well, I'll say this, that it really depends largely on where those positive samples are at. If they're in about the same areas as the other one, and we have lots of sampling and we don't detect CWD anywhere outside of, say, the Slate Creek watershed or Slate Creek and John Day Creek, then we would look at maybe fine tuning some more aggressive harvest in that area. But I will say, I mean, I would love that to be the case. And, you know, if we're having that conversation a year from now, unfortunately, based on everything I've, talking to other states, seeing what's gone on in other states, reading the research, that seems extremely unlikely that it's going to, it's not going to go anywhere. It's going to stay that low. So it's, I would like to think that would be the case, but that doesn't seem very likely. So.
Okay, thank you, Rick. I kind of had a technical snafu there and I lost a question, but Trish promised to answer it for us. It's a question about whether the Nez Perce tribe is helping us with or doing some surveillance of their own. And I think there's a second part to that. Hopefully Trish has the answer to that one.
Thank you, Roger. So we have been in contact with the tribal nations around Idaho, and we formed an Idaho working group with other agencies, and the tribal nations are part of that. We have been in contact with the Nez Perce tribe, and they're very interested in helping us sample and being part of the surveillance. They're just trying to figure out the best way in their hunt structures and with their tribal nation, the best way to assist us in that process. So we are definitely in contact with them. The Shoshone-Bannock have been in contact with us as well. So we are going to continue that dialogue to try to assist us in getting as many samples as we can.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. We have another one that just came in, and we have one a little bit on the backlog, and let's get this goes to Toby, and this is another one we've answered this in several ways, but here's a little different question. Why have increased harvest across all of Unit 14 when CWD is only in a small part of the unit?
Well, that's a great question, Roger, and the answer is that, deer travel around Unit 14 and actually outside of Unit 14. So having a hunt, we've only detected it in a couple drainages, but our ability to detect it is not 100%. Obviously, we can't sample all the deer. There is no live test. So having a hunt across the entire expanse of Unit 14 really is the best way to look at. And, for our surveillance hunts that we tried to collect sort of the other statistic, the freedom disease statistic, we did all the surrounding game management units just to make sure that it hadn't already spread. So Unit 13, Unit 18, Unit 23, portion of Unit 11A, Unit 15, so the thing is that having it over a reasonable boundary of a geographic area is important for management and for us to be able to do proper surveillance for the disease in the future.
Thank you, Toby. And we just had one come in, and I'll kick this up to our folks on the Clearwater region. It's in regard to EHD rather than CWD, and it says, how long will we eliminate the 1,500 extra doe tags? 1 year, 3 years? And I guess let's just go with the first part of that question. How long will we eliminate the 1,500 extra doe tags?
Well, I can start off in saying that, Roger. There's no really time frame for it, whether it's 1, 3, or 5. What we're looking for is we could implement that as a management tool in regards to depredation to try to reduce densities on croplands, on private lands. So there's no good number. And for the second part, it's hard to say it depends on how much population we have and how big we want to reduce that population specifically for that geographic area or unit. And it may be above 125 tags or 300 tags. It depends on how long we kind of, at what point we want to bring that population down to kind of increase the tolerance of landowners and land damage. So if that answers it. So, but there's no really time frame that we're going to automatically bring this back because we want to harvest more does in those units. It'll have to be kind of a management need.
Okay. Thank you, JJ. We've got a little lull in the live questions. We have a couple on backlog or,
There's one live question. I'll go ahead and address it. If
okay,
that's okay. I don't.
Absolutely.
So there is a question that says, what is the long-term management direction for Unit 14? I assume we will always have to have a low population. Can we ever overcome it? It seems either way, deer will have to die forever. Excellent question. And when it comes to CWD specifically, there is not a long-term management direction specifically for 14. So one of the things with CWD that we're looking at is to adaptive management approach, where what we find in terms of CWD prevalence rate and CWD distribution will really determine or help us determine what the management outcome will be. So there is not a long-term management plan in place, but and Toby kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, that once CWD is detected, yeah, you don't get rid of it completely. So, this notion about it seems deer have to die either way. That is I think a somewhat accurate observation. And I've had the question before about, well, if you have to kill all the bucks, because if you don't, all the bucks are going to die. Well, what's the point of that, right? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And so I guess I want to emphasize the issue here that we're talking largely about spread of CWD. And so keeping that prevalence rate low in 14 is in large part to protect other units and other populations of deer and elk in the surrounding units. So that's kind of the emphasis. But like I said, we will let CWD kind of what we find in terms of prevalence and distribution, that will really help us determine, dial in what the management objectives are or what the management actions are. But like I said, there is not a long-term management objective specifically for 14 or Unit 14 specific to CWD.
Thank you, Rick. Well, we're having a little lull in questions coming in, and we've answered most of the ones that folks gave us in advance. And so I see another one just came in, but we'll probably do a few more questions. And if anybody on the panel has something that they want to add to this, I'll certainly give them room here toward the end. But we did get another question just came in. What deer population does Fish and Game have for Unit 11A? Is there somebody who could field that one? We're going to put you all right on the spot.
I can take that one, Roger. So whitetails, we don't have the ability to really count. So we don't have an estimate on whitetails. Mule deer are managed generally under a pretty conservative controlled hunt. We've got some buck hunts in there. So we don't currently conduct surveys in there for mule deer, and part of that's the expense. There's a large amount of area and not tons of deer in it. So currently we manage them off harvest metrics similar to how we would whitetails.
Okay, thank you. We've got another question in. Tricia, we'll give this one to you. If CWD can't be done, or I assume that means detected with a live chest, how do we know it's 100% lethal?
That's a very good question. So here's our probably the best, easiest answer I can give you. There are live tests out there that are for research. They're not approved tests through a lot of the testing agencies that we utilize. So that would be the USDA and the National Veterinary Laboratory. They have to be approved for us to use them. And one of the things right now is they're approved for research use on game farms, not in wild animals, because they require us to anesthetize the animal to take a sample. So they're working very hard to come up with some live tests that we could put into play, but they're not ready yet. I would say maybe in the next couple of years, we'll have live tests available for us when we're doing our research captures, when we're doing some of our other fish and game activities. We should be able to employ those or deploy those into the field, but they're not ready yet. So right now, all we have are what they refer to as, tests that are done once an animal is dead, and we take those samples. So I think it's one of those things of, we know it's 100% lethal from all the research that's been done over the last 30 to 40 years, that if an animal has the disease and they've tested it and found it in them through live tests that are research-based, all of those animals die. No matter how long they let them, basically, they have them in captivity, all of those animals eventually die.
Okay, thank you, Tricia. Sounds like a pretty solid answer there to me, that we know what happens when these animals get CWD. I'll go ahead and open it up to any of our other panelists, if there's any other information that you'd like to provide, and we'll give it a couple of minutes here to see if any questions trickle in. And before we do that, I want to thank everybody who's asked questions so far. This has been really helpful, and I hope we've given you maybe not the answer you wanted to hear, but at least some good, accurate information to go on. So any of our panelists, would you like to add anything? All right. Let's see, we did get a question here. Couple more. One more popped up. We're going to do a little tightrope walk here. I'm going to read this, and then somebody can jump in to who would like to answer it. Despite more than 20,000 tests and a positivity rate less than 2%, which is 2.5 times below the critical spread density, you're proposing to more than double the harvest and significantly reduce the deer population. Explain how these rate numbers support your proposals. Would anybody like to take a stab at that one? We'll let Rick do that.
I'll take that.
Thank you, Rick.
So 5% is what Colorado has demonstrated is the point at which there's exponential growth in the prevalence rate. Doesn't mean it doesn't spread at a rate below that. So, I read that question, I think, so what do? We do nothing. We sit around until we reach 5% prevalence rate, and then we start doing something. Doesn't mean that if it's below 5%, the CWD isn't going to spread. It is going to spread, and it's going to reach 5%. And so, to me, being a manager of the public trust resource, doing nothing until we reach some artificial threshold doesn't make any sense to me. It is much easier to keep it contained and keep the prevalence rate low now than it is to allow it to go unchecked and increase the prevalence rate and spread.
Okay, thank you, Rick. We're going to take a quick pause here. We have another question in. Hopefully you all can see this. I'm going to go ahead and read it, and we'll do it the same way from the same questionnaire. CWD was only found in Slate Creek, yet your proposal is to over double the deer harvest throughout the unit. It was also found in elk near Whitebird. We are only targeting a small area for harvest, as elk are more herd oriented, move through the area of the unit, and likely to have more interactions. Why are you using an inconsistent approach to managing the same disease with a higher spread likelihood in elk than in deer? So question, I guess, there boils down to, if I may paraphrase, why are we managing deer differently than we're managing elk when it comes to this unit and CWD?
I can take that one again. So CWD is the prevalence rate is in places where deer and elk overlap is shown to be much higher in deer. And we look a lot to Colorado, Wyoming for that kind of information, and now Montana. Yes, we have migratory mule deer, we have migratory elk, we have whitetails that are at least seasonally somewhat migratory, or at least change ranges. Elk being less susceptible to CWD, we don't think at this point in time that putting additional pressure on the elk population is a good move. We did sample hunter harvested elk. We did not have any positives from that. We had the one positive at Whitebird Creek, and yes, that does raise some concerns. But when looking to the way other states like Colorado that has CWD in a lot of places among all three species, they're addressing it primarily through deer. That's our first step.
Thanks, Rick. This is when we may have had a viewer that came in a little bit later. We have kind of answered this, but let's take another stab at it. If Mother Nature took its course, how long would it take for the deer population to rebound? Wouldn't it be better to let the deer die off, rebound, and possibly provide deer future immunity rather than manage deer at low numbers for infinity? I'm not sure if this is directed toward EHD or CWD, but if somebody wants to take a stab at that from either perspective.
Well, I'll take a stab at it from the CWD perspective. What we know about CWD based on decades of experience in other states is that deer don't rebound. That's the problem. CWD does not just go away. EHD is a temporary flare-up. That's how EHD has expressed itself anyway in Idaho. We have these occasional flare-ups, largely due to weather conditions that favor the bugs that bite, the midges. But with CWD, once it takes hold, and if it reaches a level that will drive a population down, it is not going to just go away on its own. Even if that entire population were to die out, which is theoretically possible, and new deer pioneer that area and repopulate, CWD, all the research anyway has shown that those deer would probably contract CWD again because it contaminates the soil and can last up to what we've seen so far is at least 16 or 18 years and possibly longer depending on the soil type. So yeah, letting nature take its course. I'm not sure that would really be sound management.
I did notice we have a question coming that we've had from earlier that kind of slipped by me. Toby, this one, if you could field this one, why no youth hunts for the antlerless deer in these in Unit 14?
Well, I think the important thing, Roger, is that youth can put in for regular hunts. I think the idea for antlerless deer in Unit 14 was to get the samples. And it's important part of collecting CWD samples is looking at that proportion of infection rate between females and males. And, I think that it's important in this situation to get those samples taken the most efficient way possible. And I think that's why we went in the direction we did. But that's a great question.
Okay, thank you. We have another one that just came in, and if the treatment for CWD is to reduce the deer population, does this mean the era of harvesting trophy deer is over? When CWD gets to a certain area, will Idahoans be reduced to meat hunt only?
Well,
I think I can take that.
okay.
I think that obviously reducing the age structure of the population is an important management tool for CWD. Obviously, it won't eliminate bucks getting older than 2 or 3, but we find with sustained places where they've had high prevalence that the age structure naturally goes down because bucks don't live as long. And I think that trophies are in the eye of the beholder, and yeah, we're probably not going to be able to manage for either way, 6, 7-year-old bucks anymore. I think that's the cost of detecting and managing CWD is, you're not, whether you manage for it or you just let it go, you'll never have old age structure populations anyways, because CWD prevalence will get so high that they don't survive long enough to even become old bucks. And I think that that's important, that, why we're trying to get on managing the disease and managing prevalence is so it doesn't spread to other places or spreads as slowly as possible, so we can manage for mature quality, animals in places throughout Idaho. So I think it's, I think either way, you're going to get to that same point. Why don't we keep the prevalence lower? The idea is to keep the prevalence lower, reduce the spread, and not have it go to as many populations as it might if we did not control it. One of the other things that saw a question on there about, well, we don't know it's 100% lethal. Well, we do know that every deer that's ever been in captivity that has contracted CWD has ended up dead. So we do know it's 100% lethal in captive populations. And we're assuming that that lethality extends beyond to the field. So the thing is that it's an unfortunate, horrible disease that is now in 29 states in the United States, provinces, in 4 provinces in Canada, and a couple foreign countries. And, I think that CWD is one of those things that we have been planning to deal with for 20 some years. And I think that we are going to do more than other states who have sort of been a little less active in their management. And I think it's going to be to the benefit of the mule deer, white-tailed deer, elk, and moose populations in the state. And I think it's going to benefit hunters in the long term for us to do the best we can to reduce prevalence and reduce the rate of spread.
Thanks, Toby. That's good information. And I just want to kind of reiterate kind of the obvious here a little bit. There's not a lot of good news to this, and we really are in a management situation of a very, potentially, difficult to disease to manage. And not everybody's going to like the results of this thing, but we're dealing with it, and we're going to learn more as we go along. And there's a lot of research out there that's going to help us through this. And Tricia, I'm going to go back to you. This is a question that has popped up on several occasions about feeding deer, which is a little different than what we've been talking about tonight. But the question is, person found out that Idaho has no law or rules against feeding deer. That seems like a bad idea with CWD now in Idaho. Can anything be done about that?
Thank you, Roger. Actually, Idaho does have rules about feeding deer, particularly around diseases. So we do have a rule that says in a CWD management zone, which is now game management units 14 and 15, it's prohibited to feed any cervid, so any white-tailed deer, mule deer, elk, or moose in those areas. So we do actually have rules on the books to help try to protect the spread of diseases through feeding.
Excellent. Thank you for clarifying that.
So Roger, I'd like to address one of the questions on here from, talking about some of the mule deer counts. And the specific question is, what's the data? The buck-doe, specifically the buck-doe ratio data. And we have some aerial survey data for mule deer in Unit 14. that survey data. We do not have corresponding herd composition data where we get our buck doe ratio from. So what we have is we have adult mule deer and we have fawns. What we did is we took we estimated the buck doe ratio at $35 per 100 does. It's controlled hunt is for mule deer only. Controlled hunt with 160 tags. 35 per 100 is certainly within reason, but we do not have an exact number on it. But that is the basis for the number we used, looking at developing the population demographics. So we have a number. We applied an estimated buck doe ratio to it. As far as the question about the target density, there is not a target density. And you know, even if there was, I said, well, what time of year would that be? So we know we have animals, especially mule deer and elk, to concentrate on winter range. No, there is not a specific target density. We would have to know the populations of both the elk and the white-tailed deer in there to come up with that. I think type of density estimate anyway. No, the objective is to reduce the overall density. We know there's CWD in the unit, and our objective is to reduce or maintain the prevalence rate and reduce the spread, and that means reducing the density of the unit.
Okay, thank you, Rick. We have another question here. Yes. Whoever wants to field this one, it says, what happens when CWD shows up in other areas around the state? Is Fish and Game going to continue to take such drastic measures and ultimately dwindle our deer herd to nothing? Does anybody want to take that one on?
I can take that, Roger.
Thank you, Toby.
You know, I think that, you know, part of CWD management obviously involves you, the public, and the commission. And, you know, having that, you know, obviously, these are proposals we're taking to the commission. We're gathering your input. You still have time to give us input. You know, obviously, there are options. Obviously, from our perspective, doing the best job we can at managing the populations to benefit Idahoans for the future is important to us. And obviously, what we know from current research is that we have there is some success in lowering prevalence rates and lowering densities. And I think that those are two things that we're looking at. You know, obviously there's research going on. There's federal funding that's going on that's funding research in many of the states that already have CWD. We'll continue to learn more. And I think that, you know, it's not just an open and shut case that this is the way we're going to manage for the future. Obviously, public input is important for wildlife management in Idaho. Your input is important, and understanding that, you know, this is also an ultimate decision of the commission. So I think that based on the best science we know, you know, reducing the density and reducing the age structure will keep prevalence low. And for now, I think that's probably the direction we're going to recommend, but the final decisions definitely are not ours. And we appreciate all your input in this process. And we'll be learning also as we move forward, along with, you know, keeping up with all the other states, what they're learning about managing whitetails versus mule deer versus elk. You know, we know that elk populations, you know, the highest prevalence ever measured in an elk population was right around 8%. We don't know why elk get it less than whitetail and mule deer. So, but we do know, you know, one of the questions was mentioned, well, how do you know it's more prevalent in bucks? Well, looking at all the states that have been doing testing and doing lots of surveillance because they do have it, definitely have found that it's twice as prevalent in bucks as it is in does in most situations throughout the West.
Okay, thank you, Toby. We got another one come in. Let's take a little breather to just saw it, get a chance to read this so somebody can formulate an answer. And then we'll probably take a few more here and then start wrapping things up. Unless there's other things that people on the panel want to point out. And here we have, how can you make a plan without a known level and a target to achieve? You're proposing to reduce, but to what level? I'm assuming that is in regard to unit 14. I'll let one of you guys tackle this, but I think we're back to kind of the same question, or not same question, but when we're talking about reducing the spread and keeping the prevalence rate in check. But if somebody can say that a little more eloquently, intelligently than I can, I'd sure appreciate it.
Well, that does sum it up. As I've said before, the objective is to prevent spread, keep prevalence rate low, but to let the prevalence rate and the spread help us decide how to manage. So do we have a specific target for what that number is? We do for mule deer. We've identified that in our season proposals. But what really, I mean, this is a first step. I mean, I'm not going to sugarcoat it and say that we know exactly what's going to happen. We know exactly how many deer are going to be harvested based on these tag numbers, and we know exactly where they're going to come from and what everything's going to look like when it's all said and done. We have to take a step. We know that. We have to make a management recommendation to the commission on where to go. And that's what we're looking at doing. So as I've said before, numerous times, sitting on the sidelines and doing nothing about CWD would be irresponsible on our part. And there's nobody wants data more than I do. And we can never have enough data, but sometimes we don't have as much as we want. And so we've still got to make some management actions. So sitting around and wishing for better data or more data is not really a viable option.
We got another question regarding what's happened in other states. With so many years of research in other states, have deer populations been able to rebound after mitigation strategies have been implemented? Does anybody want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I can address it. I have been looking a lot at other states. So I guess it kind of comes down to what you mean by rebound. So as has been mentioned, places, it's so much not so much the state as the part of the states where they've had CWD for a long time. Like Colorado has been able to go in and reduce the prevalence rate in deer, and in some cases that has increased the deer population, not necessarily not the older age class buck population. So yes, as I think Toby mentioned this before, robust populations, younger populations, a lot of general over-the-counter tags to keep the buck population younger. But rebound, I guess that could mean different things to different people. But I think we've talked about this before too. The idea of implementing CWD control measures, and then the prevalence rate's low, so we'll take those off now. Is given what we know at this point, that seems pretty unlikely.
Thank you, Rick. We'll go back to some of our earlier questions that were given to us.
I'll address this last one that just came in. Still asking about a test for live deer and how we know CWD is more prevalent in mature bucks. We know that from hundreds of thousands of deer that have been hunter harvested, coming through check stations in states like Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, Utah, and tons of whitetail states, and research. So yes, there, and I guess, for the person who asked this question, don't take my word for it. Go out and do your own research. There is copious amounts of information out there online. Like I said, this stuff's been going on for a long time. This is not new stuff. So if our answers are unsatisfactory, then absolutely go look around, because there's lots of information out there.
Thank you, Rick. Well, I think we've pretty well covered the bases here tonight. We appreciate everybody with their questions. And is there anybody on the panel who would like to kind of address anything that we haven't talked about? Okay, I know we're scheduled till 9 o'clock. I think we're going to wrap this thing up. I think we've covered about as much as we can tonight, and I appreciate everybody who has tuned in tonight, and I especially appreciate our panelists taking on I know a lot of tough questions tonight, and like I said earlier, I don't think that we have the perfect answer for everybody, and this is going to be a tough one, but at the same time, we're going to work our way through it, and hopefully all together. And as we've mentioned several times before, we're in a one-year situation. We're going to be doing this all over again next year in our regular season setting cycles. And we certainly welcome everybody's input when that comes around, and stay tuned with us, because we'll certainly be letting you know. And hopefully we're going to learn a lot more as we coming up into the fall hunts. And so I think we're going to wrap it up for the night. Again, I just wanted to thank everybody, and I think we're signing off. So we'll keep in touch on our website. We'll have more information about CWD, about season setting. And again, the commission meeting is going to be March 23rd and 24th in Boise. So thank you, everybody, and good night.